Welcome. There is nothing that needs your attention right now. The day is done, or the evening is here, or whatever time it is the right time for this, for a slow, careful, unhurried account of what a day looked like in the Middle Ages, before any of the technology that organizes and smooths and speeds up modern life existed. Not one dramatic day, not a day of battle or plague or pilgrimage, an ordinary day. The kind of day that most people in the medieval period lived most of the time, which is to say a day of work and food and the management of basic necessities and the company of the people nearby. We are going to take our time. Let us begin. The first thing to understand about a day without modern technology in the Middle Ages is that it began differently from how our days begin. There was no alarm clock, no phone buzzing on the nightstand, no gradual brightening of a smart lamp designed to ease the transition from sleep. There was simply the light, or the cold, or the sound of animals, or the body's own internal sense of when the dark had been sufficient. Most people in medieval Europe woke when the light woke them, or very close to it. In summer, this meant waking early, the long summer days beginning before most modern people's alarms would sound. In winter, the short days meant longer nights and the possibility of more sleep, though the cold was its own kind of alarm, the fire that had been banked at night having died down enough that the chill of the room became impossible to ignore. Let us say it is an ordinary day in an ordinary season, neither the height of summer nor the depth of winter. An autumn day perhaps, or a day in the early spring. The light comes in the morning. The person waking is a craftsperson in a small market town, not a peasant farmer, though most of medieval Europe's population was rural. A market town was the natural setting for the widest range of medieval daily experience. Let us say a carpenter, a man in his 30s, established in his trade, with a workshop adjacent to his house, and a family that depended on his work. He wakes. The house is small and made of timber frames with wattle and daub walls. The interwoven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay and straw that form the standard wall material of medieval construction in much of northern Europe. The roof is thatched. The floor is packed earth covered in rushes. There is one main room that serves as kitchen and living space, and a loft above accessed by a ladder where the family sleeps. He comes down the ladder. His wife is already awake. She woke when the baby woke, which was before the main light, and has already tended the child and is now tending the fire. The fire. This is where every medieval day began. The fire. The fire was not merely for comfort or for cooking. It was the source of heat and of light and of the ability to prepare food. Without the fire, the morning was cold and the food was uncooked and the house was dark. Getting the fire going each morning was not optional. It was the first task. The fire had been banked at night, covered with ash to slow its burning so that it would retain coals through the night rather than burning out completely. A fire that retained coals through the night could be brought back to life with a breath and some kindling in the morning, which was considerably easier than starting a fire from scratch. Starting a fire from scratch required either a piece of the previous day's fire carefully transported from a neighbour's hearth, or the use of a flint and steel to strike sparks into a prepared nest of tinder. The morning fire was restored. The room began to warm. The kettle or the pot was placed over the heat. The day began in earnest. There was no running water. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Every drop of water used in the household had to be fetched. A well, if the household was fortunate enough to have one nearby, a stream, a public, conduit if the town had one. The morning's first trip for water was typically the wife's task, or the older children's, or whoever was available and willing. The water vessel, a wooden bucket or a ceramic pitcher or whatever the household used, was carried to the source, filled and carried back. This was not a quick process if the source was not immediately adjacent to the house. A walk of several minutes each way, the filled vessel heavy on the return. And this would be repeated multiple times through the day, because water was used for cooking, for washing, for watering the animals if any animals were kept, for the workshop if the work required it. The carpenter's work did sometimes require water, for the steam bending of wood, for the washing of hands, for various incidental purposes. But his primary materials were wood and iron fixings, and the workshop was primarily a place of tools and timber. Let us think about those tools. The medieval carpenter's tools were entirely hand tools, human-powered, operated by the carpenter's own body. There were no power tools, no electrical equipment, no motors of any kind. Every cut of every piece of wood was made by hand. The saw was a hand saw, a blade of iron with teeth, set in a wooden frame or held by a wooden handle, drawn back and forth by the carpenter's arm. Sawing a plank was slow, tiring work. To saw a plank from a log required either a pit saw, a two-person saw used over a pit, with one person above and one in the pit below, or a frame saw, working through the plank in the long, slow strokes that the blade allowed. There was no shortcut. The plane was a wooden body with an iron blade set in it at an angle, pushed across the surface of the wood to make it smooth and flat. The carpenter pushed the plane repeatedly across the surface, the blade removing a thin shaving with each pass. Properly flattening a board meant many passes, the hand checking the surface between passes to feel for high spots, the plane adjusted and applied again. The chisel was used for joints, the interlocking joints that held medieval woodwork together without nails in many cases, the mortise and tenon and the dovetail and the others. Cutting a mortise, a rectangular hole, in a piece of wood meant marking it out with a scribe, then chiselling out the waste wood in small increments, checking the fit of the corresponding tenon, chiselling more, checking again. Patient, incremental work. The mallet drove the chisel, the auger bored holes, the adze-shaped curved surfaces with a swinging rhythmic motion. The draw knife removed material with a pulling cut. Each tool had its specific function and its specific technique, learned over years of practice until the movements were automatic. The carpenter had been using these tools since he was old enough to hold them, first watching his father, then helping, then working alongside, then working independently. His hands knew the tools as well as they knew anything. The weight of the plane in his hand, the resistance of the wood against the blade, the sound a cut made when it was going well, all of this was bodily knowledge, accumulated through thousands of hours of practice. He went to his workshop after the morning meal. The morning meal was the first of the day's two main meals, not a large meal, not the substantial breakfast of later ages. Pottage, most likely, a thick porridge or stew made from whatever grains and vegetables and possibly meat were available, eaten from a wooden bowl with a wooden spoon, perhaps bread alongside, dense dark bread, made from rye or a mixture of grains, heavy and filling, beer or ale which was safer to drink than much of the available water, and which was made in most households or purchased from a local alewife. The pottage had been cooking since the fire was revived. It had simmered slowly, the liquid reducing and thickening, the vegetables softening. The preparation of pottage was not complicated, but it was patient. You put the ingredients in the pot, you hung the pot over the fire, you waited. The fire managed itself more or less, requiring only the occasional addition of fuel. He ate without particular attention to the eating. The food was fuel, not unpleasant. The pottage was hot and filling, and the bread was familiar, but not a source of particular pleasure either. It was morning food, eaten to power the morning's work. After eating, the workshop. The workshop was adjacent to the house, with direct access from the main room or through a door to the outside. It was a practical space, wide, with good light from the window openings on the south side, the floor covered in wood shavings from previous work, the smell of fresh cut wood permanent in the walls and the floor. His current work was a commission for a local farmer, a chest to store linens and clothing and small valuables. The chest required good joinery, tight-fitting joints that would hold without excessive iron hardware, smooth panels for the sides and the lid, a lid with proper hinges and a hasp for a lock. It was several days' work, perhaps a week, depending on the quality of the timber available and the complications that always arose. The timber for the chest had been selected from a stock of seasoned oak that had been cut and stored to dry for at least a year or two, the drying process stabilizing the wood so that it would not warp or crack after the chest was built. Seasoning timber properly required patience and planning. The carpenter who cut wood today was planning for the work of next year. He began with the sides of the chest. The boards needed to be brought to the right thickness. Currently too thick, the surfaces rough from the saw. He took the plane and began to work. The sound of the plane on the oak was a specific sound, a hissing, scraping sound with each forward stroke, the thin shaving curling away from the blade and falling to the floor. This sound, repeated in steady rhythm, was the sound of his morning. The same sound his father had made, and his father's father before that, the workshop's characteristic sound. He worked without hurry, but also without dawdling. The rhythm of the plane was the rhythm of the work, and the work had its own pace determined by the resistance of the material and the capacity of the tool and the energy of the worker. You could not make an oak board smooth faster than the oak board could be made smooth. The material had its own time. Time. In the medieval period, time was not measured or divided in the way it is now. There were no minutes. There were hours of a sort, but they were not the standardized 60-minute units of modern time. They were the canonical hours of the church, the division of the day into prayer periods that the monasteries maintained and the church bells announced. Prime at dawn, terce at the 3rd hour, sext at noon, none at the 9th hour, vespers in the evening, compline before sleep. These hours were not fixed in duration. They were defined by the position of the sun, which meant that a summer hour and a winter hour were not the same length. In summer, when the days were long, the hours between prime and sext were longer than in winter when the days were short. The carpenter's day was organized by these bells, which rang from the church in the centre of town. When the bell rang for terce, it was mid-morning and time for a small break. When the bell rang for sext, it was noon, and time for the midday rest. When the bell rang for none, it was mid-afternoon, and the working day was entering its final portion. When the bell rang for vespers, the day's work was done or close to done. In between the bells, time was not particularly marked. You worked. The work progressed, or it did not, and the state of the work was more concrete information about where you were in the day than any external measure of time would have been. He planed the boards, the shavings accumulated on the floor. The surface of the first board became smooth under his hands. He held it up to the light, the good south light coming through the window opening, and looked along the surface, checking for high spots. A slight ridge near the middle. He took the plane back to that area, working carefully. The blade set fine for the finishing pass. The board was done. He moved to the second. The morning passed in this way. The plane, the boards, the accumulation of shavings, the gradual preparation of the chest's components. This was not exciting work in any moment-by-moment sense. It was absorbing work. The kind of work that requires enough attention to prevent the mind from wandering too far, but not so much attention that the mind had no room for its own wandering at the margins. He thought about the joint for the corner of the chest, how deep the mortise should be, given the thickness of the timber, whether to cut a through mortise or a stopped one. These were practical thoughts, connected directly to the work. He also thought about the fence on the north side of his plot that needed mending, about his eldest son, who was 10 now and old enough to start learning the craft in a more serious way, about the weather, which had been unsettled for the past few days and which mattered because the timber he had drying in the yard needed to stay dry. These thoughts came and went. The planing continued. The bell rang for terse. He set down the plane and went inside for a moment. His wife had water heating. He drank something warm, an herbal infusion perhaps, or hot water with a little honey. He stretched his back, which had been bent over the work. He went out to the yard briefly to check the weather, which had cleared overnight and was now a decent late autumn morning, cool and bright. He returned to the workshop. Now let us think about what the medieval carpenter's day was like in terms of the absence of things we take for granted. No artificial light that could substitute for daylight. This was perhaps the most fundamental constraint. Work that required seeing fine detail, the marking out of joints, the fitting of parts, the finishing of surfaces, could only be done in adequate light, which meant daytime and meant positioning the work near the window. When the light failed, the fine work stopped. The carpenter could work in lamplight or candlelight on tasks that did not require precise vision. Basic sawing by feel, simple assembly, cleaning and organizing the workshop. But the quality work required the light, and the light was only available during the day. This meant that the medieval craftsman's relationship to daylight was fundamentally different from a modern craftsman's. You worked while the light allowed, and you stopped when it did not, and you organized your work accordingly. In summer, long days meant long working hours. In winter, the short days compressed the productive hours into a smaller window. No telephone or internet or any communication technology beyond the physical presence of a person or the written word carried by another person. If the carpenter needed to communicate with the farmer who had commissioned the chest, he went to the farmer or sent a child with a message. If the farmer needed to communicate with the carpenter, he came to the workshop or sent someone. All communication required the physical movement of a person or a written document. Most medieval people were not literate. The carpenter might not read or write, in which case written communication was not available to him at all. Communication was direct, face to face, or through trusted intermediaries who could deliver a spoken message accurately. This had implications for the range and speed of information available to him. What he knew about the wider world came through travellers, through the gossip of the market, through the announcements made from the church steps. It was slow, partial, filtered through many mouths. He knew a great deal about his immediate world, accumulated through years of careful local observation. He knew the names of every householder on his street and their general circumstances. He knew the quality of the timber in several nearby woodlots, and which was best for which purpose. He knew the church calendar thoroughly, because it organised his year. He knew the prices at the local market and how they changed with the seasons. But the world beyond a day's walk or ride was largely abstract. He knew that the king existed. He knew that there were places called London and Paris and Rome. He might have heard of a war or a plague at some distance, news arriving weeks or months after the fact, filtered through many retellings and uncertain in its details. No refrigeration. The food available at any moment was limited to what had been grown or preserved. In this particular season, autumn, there would be fresh vegetables from the harvest, turnips, parsnips, cabbages, onions, leeks. There would be dried legumes, there would be salt meat and salt fish, there would be grain and the bread and pottage made from it. There would be apples and other fruit in abundance at this season, to be eaten fresh or dried for winter. The planning and management of food was a major household occupation. The winter was coming, and the winter's food supply was already being assembled. The salting of meat from recently slaughtered animals, the drying of fruits and vegetables, the storage of root vegetables in cool cellars, the careful management of the grain supply. Every household that survived the winter did so through the accumulation and careful management of stores that were assembled in the productive seasons. No mechanical assistance in the basic work of life. Every bucket of water fetched by human strength, every piece of wood sawn by the saw, drawn by a human arm, every batch of bread kneaded by human hands. The physical demands of daily life in the Middle Ages were considerably higher than the physical demands of modern life for most people. The medieval body was used heavily in the ordinary course of existence. This had its consequences. The medieval body was generally stronger in certain ways. The muscles developed by daily physical work were real, and the people who did agricultural and craft labour were genuinely physically capable. But it also meant that physical deterioration was felt sooner and more severely. Injuries from physical labour were common. The body wore out faster in some respects, though the lack of sedentary lifestyle meant that certain modern ailments were less common. The noon bell rang. The carpenter set down his work and went inside for the midday meal, which was the main meal of the day. The midday meal was more substantial than the morning pottage. Bread. Perhaps more pottage, or perhaps something cooked more specifically for the noon meal, a piece of salt fish or salt meat if the household had it, vegetables from the garden or the market, a thick broth made from bones, ale or cider. In a prosperous craftsman's household, the noon meal might include an egg or two from the chickens kept at the yard, The meal was eaten at the table, a trestle table set up for the meal and taken down again afterward in many households. The boards of the tabletop stored against the wall. The family ate together, the carpenter, his wife, the children, perhaps a journeyman or apprentice if the workshop employed one. Table manners in the medieval period were different from modern manners, but not as different as popular imagination suggests. People ate with spoons and with the fingers and with knives. Forks were not yet standard, and they shared dishes in a way that modern individual plate service does not. The etiquette of sharing a dish, of taking your portion without taking more than your share, of offering to others before serving yourself, was as real as any modern etiquette, simply organised around different practices. He ate with appetite. The morning's work had been physical, and physical work created genuine hunger. The bread was dense and filling. The broth was hot. After eating, the midday rest. The siesta in Southern European cultures, or the equivalent period in Northern European cultures, was a standard feature of the medieval day. Work stopped. People rested. The intensity of the midday sun in summer made outdoor work impractical. The custom of resting at midday adapted to this seasonal pressure and became a year-round habit. He lay down in the main room, or perhaps in the yard if the weather was fine, and rested for perhaps an hour. This rest was genuine. He did not lie awake reviewing the morning's work or planning the afternoon's. He rested, and sometimes he slept briefly, and the body recovered from the morning's effort. Then the afternoon. Work continued where the morning had left off. The boards were planed. Now the carpenter turned to the joint work, the more precise work of fitting the parts together. A mortise and tenon joint. The tenon is the projecting part of one piece, shaped to fit into the mortise hole of the other. Cutting the tenon required careful marking out, the measurements transferred from one piece to the other with a marking gauge, the scribe line precise. Then the saw, cutting along the lines, the waste falling away. Then the chisel, cleaning up the shoulders of the tenon to make them flat and smooth. The mortise was cut in the receiving piece. The auger bored a series of holes to remove most of the waste wood. Then the chisel worked around the perimeter of the mortise, cutting cleanly to the scribe line, squaring the corners. The work in the corners required small, precise chisel cuts, the bevel of the chisel cutting at just the right angle to clean the corner without breaking out the surrounding wood. The joint was tried, the tenon inserted into the mortise. It was too tight. He identified which part of the tenon was binding, running a finger along the joint, feeling the friction, and pared the tenon carefully with a sharp chisel. Tried again. Still slightly tight. Pared a little more. Tried. Fit. This fitting, the back and forth between the cut and the test, the pairing and the trying, was the core of the joiner's work. It could not be rushed. It took as long as it took. The joint that was properly fitted would last generations. The joint that was not properly fitted would loosen and fail. He made 4 such joints in the afternoon. Each one took roughly the same time as the last. The light moved across the workshop floor as the afternoon progressed, the sun moving to the west, the light coming now from a different angle through the south windows. The bell rang for none. He was working on the last joint of the 4. He continued. The bell for none was mid-afternoon, and there was still working light. He would finish the joint before stopping. The last joint was completed. He tested the fit one more time. It was good. He swept the worst of the shavings to one side, not a thorough cleaning that could wait, and went in to wash his hands and assess the day. The evening meal was being prepared. His wife had the fire going again, a pot hanging over it. The children were doing their various tasks, the older ones helping, the younger ones underfoot or playing in the yard before it got too dark. The preparation for the evening meal, the chopping of vegetables, the management of the fire, the baking of bread if the household's oven was being used, was a substantial labour in itself, invisible to the modern observer but real and considerable. Everything from scratch, every time, with no ready-made ingredients and no shortcuts. The bread, if fresh bread was being made today, had been started earlier in the afternoon. The dough mixed, flour and water and a small amount of the sourdough starter kept in a crock and refreshed regularly. The dough kneaded, which was hard work, pressing and folding and pressing again, the gluten developing under the hands over 15 or 20 minutes of steady working. The dough left to rise near the fire's warmth, covered with a cloth, then shaped into loaves, then baked in the clay oven that had been preheated with a fire inside it, the fire then raked out and the loaves put in to bake in the retained heat. The baking of bread in a clay oven without a thermometer was skill, not science. You learned by experience what the oven's heat felt like, a hand held inside for a few seconds, the heat on the face when the door was opened, and you learned to read these cues accurately enough to know when the temperature was right for baking. Too hot, and the crust burned before the interior was done. Too cool, and the bread baked slowly and might not rise properly. Knew the oven. He had helped load it hundreds of times. He could judge its heat by the feel. Alternatively, bread was not baked at home at all. Many households in medieval towns used the communal oven, the town oven, operated by the baker, where households brought their prepared dough to be baked for a fee. The communal oven was more efficient than individual household ovens, and using it freed the household from the task of maintaining their own oven. Either way, bread was daily work. The evening meal came together as the light diminished. Candles and perhaps the oil lamp were lit, a small, warm, yellow light quite different from the broad daylight that had illuminated the day's work. The family gathered. They ate. The conversation at the evening meal was the conversation of people who had spent the day in close proximity to each other and to the news of the small world they inhabited. His wife had been to the market that morning and had heard news. A neighbour's cow had sickened, which was a concern because the neighbour was a widow with children and the cow was important to her livelihood. A travelling merchant had come through with cloth from somewhere further away, and the prices had seemed fair. The priest had announced that there would be a special observance for the upcoming feast day of the local patron saint. These were small things. They were the currency of information in a world without newspapers or social media or any mechanism for the rapid distribution of news. Small things mattered precisely because they were all you had. The widow's sick cow was real news, worthy of attention, the kind of thing that the community needed to know and might need to respond to. He listened. He added what he had observed. A man he had spoken with briefly at the well that morning, who had come from a village 2 days' walk away, and who had mentioned something about road conditions on that route. This information was useful. He had a delivery to make in that direction in a few weeks, and road conditions mattered. The light from the candle lit the table and the faces around it and left the corners of the room in shadow. The fire gave additional warmth and its own light. Outside, the darkness was the darkness of a town without street lighting. Truly dark. The kind of dark that modern people rarely experience, where a moonless night in a cloudless sky was the stars and nothing else, and an overcast night was genuinely dark. The town had a curfew, literally a couvre-feu, cover-fire order, at a specific hour in the evening. This required that fire and light be covered or extinguished in the streets, both for fire safety and as a mechanism of social order. After curfew, movement through the streets was restricted or controlled. Most people were inside and in bed well before curfew. Going to bed, for a medieval craftsman's household, was not a matter of checking the phone one last time or watching a little more television. It was a straightforward transition from the last activity of the evening, sitting by the fire, perhaps mending clothing or doing simple handwork by the firelight, perhaps telling a story, to lying down on the sleeping surface. The sleeping surface was a straw mattress on a wooden platform covered with linen or wool. The linen was the household's own production, or purchased from a weaver. The mattress was refilled periodically with fresh straw. Old straw compacted and ceased to provide much cushioning. The blanket over the sleeper was wool, heavy and warm. He went to the ladder and climbed to the loft. The loft was low-ceilinged, with the roof coming down close on both sides. The mattresses were laid directly on the board floor. The children were already there, or were going there now. He lay down. The fire below, banked for the night, gave a faint warmth through the floor. The house settled into its night sounds, the small sounds of the building, the sounds of the animals. In the yard, the distant sounds of the town, and the night itself was quiet in the deep, complete way of a world without cars or aircraft or machinery, without the constant background hum of modern civilization. The sounds that existed were natural and intermittent. Wind in the thatch, an animal in the distance, the creak of the building in the cold. This quiet was the quiet that he knew every night. The day had been as it was every day. The fire, the water, the work, the tools, the meals, the news of small things, the children, the evening, the sleep. No device to check, no screen to glance at, no notifications, no background anxiety about something seen earlier that was still unresolved. No light pollution seeping under the shutters from the street outside. Just the dark, and the quiet, and the tiredness of a body that had been used, and sleep, which came, as it came every night, quickly and completely, as it can come for you, in your dark, in your quiet, however much quiet you have available. The day is done, the tools are set aside, the fire is banked, the ladder is climbed, the loft is reached, and sleep is here. Good night. For those still awake, if you are still awake, let us go back to the medieval day and spend more time in it, because there is more to say, and the night is long, and the details, when they come slowly enough, have a way of filling the mind with something gentle. Let us think about the hand tools more carefully. The plane we described is worth returning to. The medieval plane was a wooden block with an iron blade set through it at an angle. The blade was secured by a wedge of wood driven in above it. No screws, no adjustment mechanisms, just the wedge and the blade and the block. Setting the blade to the right depth, taking off a thin shaving rather than a thick gouge, was done by tapping the blade gently with a mallet, listening and feeling for the right setting, testing on a scrap of wood. This setting of the blade was a daily small calibration. The blade loosened slightly with use and needed to be reset. The act of tapping the blade and testing it, tapping again, was automatic after years of practice, not thought about consciously. The hands knew what to do. The saw was a different kind of tool. The medieval carpenter's frame saw had a blade of iron with teeth cut into it, held in tension in a wooden frame by a twisted cord running between the tops of the frame's two uprights. This cord twisted tight with a wooden toggle, and then the toggle seated against the frame held the blade in tension, like the string of a bow. When the cord was tight, the blade was under tension and sawed straight. When the cord loosened over time, the blade wandered. The maintenance of the saw, the keeping of the cord at the right tension, the sharpening of the teeth when they dulled, the setting of the teeth so that the saw's cut was slightly wider than the blade's thickness and the blade did not bind, was the carpenter's own responsibility. There was no hardware store where you went to buy a new blade. You maintained what you had, and you learned to maintain it well because replacement was expensive and slow. The sharpening of tools was a regular part of the working day. A dull chisel was a frustrating and dangerous chisel. It required more force and was less predictable in its cut than a sharp one. The sharpening was done on a whetstone, a flat stone of the right grit, wetted with water. The chisel held at the correct angle and moved in a circular or figure-8 pattern across the stone until the edge was keen. Testing the edge of a chisel was done by shaving the arm hair. If the edge shaved the hair, it was sharp. If it did not, it needed more work. This test was automatic, done without thinking. The forearm held up and the chisel drawn across the hair. Sharp. Not yet sharp. Sharp. The tools were well cared for. They were the man's livelihood. A tool that rusted or chipped or lost its edge was a tool that could not do its work, and a carpenter without working tools was a carpenter who could not work, and a carpenter who could not work was a family without income. The care of tools was therefore the care of the family's future. Let us now think about what the town sounded like during the working day. The medieval town in the working hours of a weekday had a specific and complex soundscape. The loudest sounds were the sounds of crafts and trades, the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil, which could be heard at a considerable distance, a regular metallic ringing that was one of the defining sounds of any town that had a smith. The sound of the mill, if there was a mill at work, the grinding of millstones, the creak of the wheel, the sounds of the market, if market day fell this day, the voices of sellers, the sounds of animals brought to market. Below these were the sounds of ordinary household activity, the sound of someone chopping wood for fuel, the cluck of chickens in a yard, the voices of women at the well, the sound of a child crying somewhere, the sound of hammering from a rooftop where repairs were being made, and underneath all of it, the church bell. The bell marked the hours, reminded the town of the structure of the day. The bell for the Angelus in the morning, at noon, and in the evening, a signal for prayer that was observed to varying degrees by the population, but that was heard by everyone, regardless of their observance. The bell was the town's clock, its single shared timekeeper. The carpenter, in his workshop, heard the town's sounds as a background. The blacksmith's hammer told him what day and what time it was in a general way. The smith worked to a schedule, and the rhythm of the hammer was part of the day's texture. the market sounds, when they came from the direction of the market square, told him it was market day. He was part of this soundscape himself, the sound of his plane, the sound of his mallet striking a chisel, the sound of his saw going back and forth. These sounds were heard by the household next door and by the people who passed in the street outside the workshop. The working town was a town of overlapping sounds, each household and each workshop contributing its particular note. Now let us think about the children of the medieval craftsman's household. Children in the medieval period occupied a different role in the household than modern children do. They were not exempt from work. From a very young age, perhaps 5 or 6, children were given small tasks suited to their size and strength. Fetching and carrying, watching younger siblings, collecting fuel, small sticks and twigs, dried dung in areas where this was used for fuel, tending the chickens in the yard. As children grew older, their responsibilities grew. A girl of 10 or 12 was doing a significant share of the household's textile work. The carding and spinning of wool or flax was continuous work that was done at every spare moment, often while walking or talking, the spindle turning in the hand while the mind was elsewhere. A boy of 10 or 12 was beginning to learn his father's trade, or a trade to which he would be apprenticed. The carpenter's eldest son, 10 years old, had been in the workshop for the last year or so, watching and helping with the simpler tasks. He swept the shavings, he fetched tools, he was learning to hold the plane, though his arms were not yet strong enough for the sustained effort of planing a board. He watched his father's hands at the mortise and tenon work, learning the sequence of cuts, learning the feel of the chisel in the wood. This learning by watching was the primary pedagogy of medieval craft education. You watched someone who knew what they were doing. You tried what you had watched. You were corrected. You watched again. Over years, the knowledge moved from the teacher's hands to the students. It could not be transferred by words alone. The bodily knowledge of craft required bodily learning. The boy in the workshop was doing something more than learning a trade. He was absorbing a relationship with material, with tools, with the physical world of making. He was learning that things did not happen quickly, that quality required patience, that the material had its own nature, and you had to work with it rather than against it. These were lessons that would shape his relationship with everything he made for the rest of his life. Let us now think about the absence of medical technology. In the medieval world, illness and injury were managed with the tools available, which were limited in specific ways. There were no antibiotics, no surgical anesthetics, no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no x-rays to diagnose broken bones precisely. There were herbal remedies, some of which were effective in limited ways. There was surgical knowledge, though surgery was a last resort. There were prayers and saints' intercessions. The carpenter in his workshop risked the standard injuries of woodworking, cuts from chisels and saws, crushed fingers from the mallet, splinters that might become infected. These injuries were treated with whatever the household knew, cleaning with water and wine perhaps, poultices of various herbs, bandaging with strips of cloth. A small cut on the finger, if it became infected, could develop into something serious in the absence of antibiotics. The progression from a small infection to blood poisoning was a real and not infrequent occurrence. People died from what today would be trivially treatable injuries, and this was known and accepted as a reality of life. This fragility, the body's susceptibility to injury and infection that modern medicine has significantly reduced, shaped the medieval person's relationship to their body and to health. The body was cared for, but its vulnerability was understood and accepted. Religious interpretation of illness as divine test or punishment was one framework. Practical herbal knowledge was another. The carpenter who stayed healthy through decades of physical work was a fortunate person. Not because he was never injured. Minor injuries were probably frequent, but because none of the injuries developed into something beyond treatment. Fortune, in this domain, was genuinely a matter of life and death. Let us now think about the evening more carefully, because the evening is where we are heading. The evening in the medieval craftsman's house began when the daylight became insufficient for work. This was not a specific time on a clock. It was a specific quality of light. The point at which the detail work became difficult to see, at which the eye was straining to see what the hand was doing. When this point came, the carpenter put down his work and came inside. In summer, this might be quite late. The long summer evenings allowed work to continue well past what we would call dinner time. In the shorter days of autumn it came earlier, and in winter the working day might end in what we would think of as mid-afternoon. The transition from work to evening was marked by the washing of hands, the tools left behind, the shavings on the floor, the commission in its current state. All of these could wait for tomorrow. The hands covered in the marks of the day's work needed washing. Water for washing was in the bucket fetched that morning, now somewhat depleted by the day's various uses. He poured some over his hands, rubbed them together, wiped them on a rough cloth. The sawdust and the oil from the wood and the grime of the day's handling were removed as well as could be managed without soap or much water. Then the evening. The evening fire was built up from the banked coals of the afternoon. The room filled with warmth. The candle or the lamp was lit. One light, not several, both because of the cost of fuel, and because one light in a small room was enough. The family gathered. The evening was a time of lower energy activity. Not because there was nothing to do. There was always something to do. But because the most demanding work was done, and the hours before sleep were for tasks that did not require full concentration or full physical effort. His wife spun. The drop spindle turned in her hand while she sat near the fire, the wool fibre drawing out and twisting into thread. She had been spinning at odd moments through the day, while talking, while the baby slept on her lap, while waiting for something to heat or cook, and she spun now in the evening as a matter of course. The thread accumulating on the spindle would eventually be enough to weave into cloth, or would be traded for cloth already woven. He mended. A leather strap on a tool had cracked, and he worked it with a pointed awl and a length of waxed linen thread, stitching the crack together. This was not skilled work. It was patient, practical work, making a thing functional again that had ceased to be functional. The children were given their own tasks or allowed to play quietly in the remaining space of the room. The older ones helped with the mending or the spinning or the preparation of whatever else needed preparing. The younger ones watched and played and gradually succumbed to sleep. The youngest child was put to bed first, carried to the loft and laid on the mattress, covered carefully. The next youngest was not far behind. The older children stayed up a little longer until their drooping eyes made it clear that the day had used them up. And then the adults sat in the diminishing light of the fire and the candle, talking or not talking, doing their small tasks or setting them aside, letting the day wind down. There was no clear moment when the evening became sleep. There was a gradual dimming of activity, a settling, a series of small final tasks. The fire banked, the candle extinguished, the shutters secured, that ended with the climbing of the ladder and the lying down, and then sleep. And now you're also in an evening of some kind, and the day is also winding down. And the tasks of your own day are also setting themselves aside. And the quiet is here, or more of it is here than earlier, and sleep is close, as it was close for the carpenter in his loft, the thatch above him, the night outside, the town quiet, the fire below banked and warm. Good night. The tallow candle. The candle that lit the medieval household's evening was usually a tallow candle. Tallow is rendered animal fat, specifically the fat of cattle or sheep, melted and clarified and then used to make candles by dipping a wick repeatedly into the liquid tallow, each dip adding a thin layer that hardened as it cooled. Tallow candles were cheaper than beeswax candles, which were used in churches and wealthy households, but were too expensive for ordinary household use. The tallow candle burned with a warm yellowish flame that was less bright and less steady than a beeswax candle. It smoked more. It had a smell, not an unpleasant smell exactly, but a specific smell of rendered animal fat burning slowly, a heavy, slightly greasy smell that was simply the smell of evening in a medieval household. The wick of the tallow candle needed to be trimmed periodically. As the candle burned, the wick carbonized at the tip and became too long, causing the flame to smoke and sputter and to consume the tallow inefficiently. Trimming the wick, snuffing it to a shorter length, or pinching off the carbon tip with fingers or a small tool, restored the clean, steady flame. This small maintenance was done automatically, part of the background management of the evening light. One candle was the standard allocation for a modest household in the evening. One candle provided enough light to see what you were doing in the immediate vicinity of the flame and left the rest of the room in shadow. You positioned yourself near the candle for tasks that required seeing, the stitching, the spinning, the reading if you read, the attention to a small child's face. The shadow that the single candle cast was sharp and warm, the objects in the room throwing dark shadows on the walls as the flame moved in the slight air currents of the room. The fire gave additional light, the orange glow of the coals supplementing the candle's yellow flame. This was the light of the medieval evening, not bright, not steady, not the kind of light that extended the productive hours into the night the way electric light does. It was the light of slowing down, of the smaller activities, of the body's preparation for the dark. The candle was extinguished when sleep came, or it burned itself out if someone fell asleep without extinguishing it, which was a real fire hazard. The reason for the curfew, the reason for the careful banking of fires before sleep, the reason that fire was understood as a constant threat in a world of wooden buildings and thatched roofs and open flames. The candle goes out, the fire glows in the hearth below, the room is in the warm near dark of a banked fire, and sleep. Good night. The apprentice. In the workshop, there was sometimes an apprentice. Not in every household, not in every workshop. But for a successful carpenter with more work than he could manage alone, taking on an apprentice was the natural next step. An apprentice in the medieval system was a boy of perhaps 10 to 14 who had been formally bound to the master craftsman, usually through a written indenture signed by the boy's parents or guardian for a period of years, typically 7 years, though this varied. During the apprenticeship, the boy lived in the master's household, received food and lodging and training but no wages, and was entirely under the master's authority and responsibility. The apprentice's daily life was the workshop's daily life. He woke when the household woke. He fetched and carried and swept and helped. He watched the master work and gradually, year by year, was trusted with more skilled tasks. By the end of 7 years, a well-trained apprentice could do most of the work of the craft independently, though not yet with the speed and sureness of the master. The apprenticeship system was the medieval world's mechanism for transmitting craft knowledge. It worked because the transmission of craft knowledge required sustained, embodied learning. You could not learn to be a carpenter from a book, and the craft guild system that regulated the trade ensured that the knowledge was passed from master to apprentice in a systematic way. The carpenter in our story might have an apprentice or might not, depending on the volume of his work and his household's capacity to support an additional person. If he had one, the apprentice was there in the loft at night, sleeping on his own mattress, part of the household. The apprentice's experience of the day was different from the master's in specific ways. He was younger and less experienced, doing tasks that were less skilled and more tiring in certain ways. The carrying and the fetching and the sweeping were the apprentice's work, not the master's. But he was learning, and the learning was the compensation. Whether a particular apprentice found the work interesting or tedious depended on the boy and on the master, and on the nature of the work in any given period. Sometimes the work was fascinating, watching the master cut a complex joint, seeing a piece of furniture emerge from rough timber. Sometimes it was very dull, sweeping shavings again, fetching water again, holding a board steady while someone else did the interesting part. The dullness was part of the learning. The sweeping and the fetching were not the point, but they were in the vicinity of the point, and being in the vicinity of the work day after day, week after week, the knowledge accumulated even in the dull moments. At night the apprentice lay on his mattress in the loft and thought the thoughts of a boy far from home, or did not think much at all, or fell asleep quickly from the tiredness of the day's work. The loft was his sleeping place, the family's home his home for now, the workshop his education, and now he sleeps, as all the apprentices of all the medieval workshops slept, in lofts and back rooms and on floors after the days of carrying and watching and learning. And you sleep in your own version of wherever you rest after your own day of whatever kind of work it was. Good night. The seasonal character of medieval life. What we have been describing is an autumn day, but the character of the medieval day changed substantially with the season, more so than modern life does. In winter, the short days compressed the working hours. The carpenter's active work, the detail work that required seeing, was confined to the few hours when the light was adequate. The mornings were darker and the evenings came earlier. The cold was a constant presence, managed by clothing and fire but never entirely overcome. The food supply was from the stores assembled in the more productive seasons. Winter was also a time of different work. Outdoor work was reduced or impossible. The workshop work continued, but with more emphasis on the indoor tasks, the fitting of joints, the finishing work, the planning of commissions for the coming year. For the agricultural population, winter was a time of indoor crafts, the spinning and the weaving, the mending and the making, the work that required hands but not fields. In summer, the long days allowed extended work hours. The carpenter could be in the workshop from well before breakfast until well after the evening meal, the light persisting far into the evening. The heat was its own challenge. The workshop in summer, particularly when working the wood that generated its own warmth from the friction of cutting, could become uncomfortable. Summer was also the season of greatest agricultural activity, and even craftspeople were connected to this rhythm. They might help with their neighbours' harvests, or tend their own kitchen garden at the peak of its productivity, or manage the provisions that summer produced for preservation. Spring and autumn were the transitional seasons, neither the extremes of summer's plenty or winter's constriction. Autumn in particular had its own specific character. The abundance of the harvest, the urgency of preparation for winter, the shortening days reminding you that the cold was coming, and everything that could be done before it arrived should be done now. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that you lived differently in different seasons, not just in terms of the weather, but in terms of the available light and the available food and the available work. The body adapted to these seasonal rhythms, and the adaptation was felt. Summer energy, winter conservation, the specific tiredness of harvest and the specific restlessness of spring. The carpenter in his loft on an autumn night was in the particular state of autumn, not the expansive energy of summer, not the conserving stillness of winter, but the productive seriousness of a season when things needed to be prepared and the time for preparation was limited. This specificity, the specific quality of this season, this day, this light, was a feature of life without the technologies that now buffer us against seasonal variation. The medieval person felt the season in their body more directly, lived in it more completely. You are in a season too, whatever season it is outside. The specific quality of the air and the light and the temperature, the specific character of this part of the year, and the night of this season is here, with its specific dark and specific quiet, and sleep is here in it. Good night. The church bell. In the night. There was one night bell. At some point in the deep of the night, a single bell from the church tower. Not the elaborate pattern of the canonical hours, simply one bell, ringing at a specific hour that varied by town and by custom. This bell served as a reminder, if anyone was still awake and listening, of where they were in the night. Most people were not awake to hear it. The carpenter in his loft, the children on their mattresses, the wife who had fallen asleep after the baby's last feeding. All of them were in the middle of their night's sleep when the bell rang, but occasionally someone was awake. A mother with a colicky infant up and rocking the child, a person with a toothache or a fever unable to sleep, a person whose mind had woken them from a dream that had not yet released them. For these waking people, the night bell placed them in the night. You were somewhere in the dark hours, and the bell told you roughly where. After this bell was several more hours until dawn. You knew this. You could use this knowledge. A person lying awake in the medieval night after hearing the bell had no particular entertainment available, no phone to look at, no book to reach for, or if there was a book, no sufficient light to read it by. No one to text or speak to without waking the household. There was only the dark and the thoughts that the dark offered, and the sounds of the sleeping household around you, and the distant sounds of the town. This enforced interior life. The medieval night was necessarily an interior experience, was simply the condition of the night. People lived with their own minds more directly in those hours than modern people typically do, because there were fewer external distractions available to compete with the mind's own activity. Whether this was better or worse than the modern alternative is not a question this story is going to answer. It was simply different. The bell rang, and the night continued, and eventually the sleep returned, and in the morning the light, as the light will come for you, after the night that is here now. The dark is here now, and the quiet is here now, and the sleep is here. Good night. What the carpenter knew. Let us spend a moment with what the carpenter knew, because his knowledge was specific and real and different from what we know. He knew wood, not in the abstract. He knew the specific character of each species he worked with. Oak was hard and strong and durable, the right choice for structural work and for pieces that would bear weight. Elm was tough and stringy, difficult to split, good for the seats of chairs that would be sat upon hard. Ash was flexible and resilient, excellent for tool handles. Willow was soft and light, useful for baskets and lightweight work. Apple and pear were dense and fine-grained, beautiful for small-turned pieces and decorative work. He knew not just the species, but individual pieces of timber in his stock. This piece of oak had a run of grain that would be difficult in this direction but excellent in another. This plank had a slight twist that needed to be managed. This log, when he sawed it, would yield pieces of specific sizes, and he knew how to saw it to get the most useful pieces. This knowledge of wood, the specific tactile observational knowledge of the material, was the foundation of his craft. It was learned by working with wood over many years, by the accumulation of thousands of small observations, how this wood responded to this tool, what happened when you tried to force the grain rather than work with it, what the colour of a freshly cut surface told you about the moisture content. He knew the joints, not in abstract but physically. The specific feeling of a well-fit tenon entering a mortise, the slight resistance that indicated a good fit without being so tight as to split the wood. The squareness of a well-made joint checked with the eye and the hand. The satisfaction of a completed joint that was both strong and seamless. He knew the seasons of timber. When to fell trees for the best timber, winter, when the sap was down, was generally preferred. How long to season different species? What conditions cause timber to check or warp during seasoning? How to manage a timber pile to maintain proper airflow while protecting from rain. He knew construction, the geometry of a simple building, how the joists carried the floor, how the rafters carried the roof, how the load was transferred from the structure to the ground. Not in the formal language of engineering, but in the practical, observed knowledge of someone who had built and repaired many structures. All of this knowledge was in him, embodied, the result of decades of practice and observation. None of it was in a book he could refer to. None of it was in a database or a search engine. It was in his hands and his eyes and his accumulated memory of working with wood. This kind of knowledge, embodied, practical, accumulated, is not extinct. There are still craftspeople who carry it, but in the medieval world it was universal in trades. The knowledge was in the person, passed from person to person through the apprenticeship system, maintained as long as the trade continued and lost when it did not. The carpenter took his knowledge to bed with him every night, and it was there when he woke in the morning. As you take with you what you know, what you have learned through years of your own practice and observation, your own embodied knowledge of whatever you do and know, and now the knowledge rests, as the body rests, in the dark, in the quiet. Good night. The absence of numbers. There is something else worth noticing about the medieval carpenter's day, the relative absence of numbers. Modern life is saturated with numbers. The time is displayed in hours and minutes and seconds on every device. Prices are exact to the penny. Distances are measured in miles or kilometers. Temperatures are given in degrees. Speeds, weights, volumes, all of these are quantified with precision and are constantly available to be checked. The medieval carpenter's day had far fewer numbers. The time was approximate, mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, rather than precise. The price of his commission was agreed through negotiation and was expressed in local currency, but the negotiation was as much qualitative as quantitative. The quality of the work, the relationship between the buyer and the seller, the custom of the community. Distances were expressed in days of travel rather than in miles. The measurement in the workshop was done with instruments, the marking gauge set by feel, the square checked by eye, the measurements transferred directly from one piece to another without being translated into numbers at all. The mortise was not 1 inch wide and 2 inches deep. It was the width of this chisel and the depth that this timber and this joint required, judged by the craftsman's experience. This does not mean the medieval world was imprecise. The precision of a well-made medieval joint is measurable in fractions of a millimetre. The precision of a well-built medieval timber frame is visible in the structures that have survived 700 years without significant distortion. Precision existed, but it was bodily precision, the precision of the practiced hand and eye rather than the precision of measurement. The absence of constant numerical monitoring also meant a different relationship to the passage of time. You did not check how many minutes had passed since you started planing the board. You planed the board until it was flat. Time was measured in work done, not in minutes consumed. This relationship to time, task-based rather than clock-based, is experienced by people who work in craft traditions today as a specific quality of attention. The work demanded what it demanded and you gave it, and when it was done, it was done. In the workshop, the carpenter's attention was on the wood and the tools, not on the clock, not on the next thing, not on the thing after that. The wood, the tools, the joint, this moment of this work, which is, in its own way, a form of the attention that sleep asks of us, not the future, not the past, this moment, this breath, this dark, this quiet, good night, the weather. The medieval carpenter's day was governed by the weather in ways that modern work is generally not. If it rained, outdoor work stopped. Not because of modern health and safety concerns, but because outdoor work in rain was largely impractical. Wet wood behaved differently than dry. The joints swelled, the surfaces could not be finished. And standing in rain doing physical work was unpleasant and potentially a source of illness. The weather was observed carefully, because the consequences of misjudging it were real. A stack of timber left in the yard without adequate covering when rain came was a loss. A roof repair begun and not completed before a sudden downpour was damaged work. The farmer's harvest left in the field when a storm arrived could be ruined. Weather observation was done by the same means as everything else in the medieval world. Direct sensory observation, accumulated experience, folk knowledge passed down. The colour of the sky at sunset told you something about the next day's weather. The behaviour of animals told you something. The smell of the air, the direction of the wind, the presence of certain clouds. All of these were read by experienced observers and translated into expectations about what was coming. Some of this folk weather knowledge was accurate. The red sky at night and red sky in the morning observation has genuine meteorological basis, as we discussed in another story. The observation that certain cloud formations preceded specific weather was real. Pattern recognition, even if the mechanism was not understood. But weather prediction was imperfect, as it still is, and the medieval person's response to weather imprecision was pragmatic. You watched the sky, you made your best judgment, you planned what you could plan, and you accepted what could not be planned for. Today's weather had been good. The autumn morning that allowed the outdoor components of the work to be done while the conditions permitted, the afternoon that had stayed dry and allowed the yard work to proceed. A good day for the purpose. Tomorrow the weather might change. He would read the sky in the evening and have some sense of what to expect. And then tomorrow would be whatever it would be. The weather did not ask his permission. The night weather did not ask yours. Whatever the night is doing outside, however cold or warm, however still or windy, it is doing it without requiring your response. You are inside, the weather is outside, and the night is here, and sleep is here. Good night. The town around the workshop. The carpenter's workshop was not isolated. It was in a town, and the town was a living organism of which the workshop was one small part. Around the workshop were other workshops. The blacksmith, whose hammer rang through the morning. The tanner, whose smell reached a considerable distance, and who was typically required to be at the edge of town for this reason. The baker, whose oven produced bread for households that did not bake their own, and who started their night's work well before dawn. The alewife, who made ale in her kitchen and sold it from a pole hung outside the door, the original pub sign. Between the workshops were the houses, some larger, some smaller, all of them timber and thatch and wattle and daub, all of them organised around the same basic requirements. A main room, a sleeping loft or sleeping room, a yard for the animals and the kitchen garden. The town had a weekly market day, when the surrounding countryside brought its produce, and the craftspeople brought their goods, and the merchants passed through with items from elsewhere. The market day was the most socially complex day of the week, when the town swelled with people from outside and the ordinary townspeople bought and sold and heard news and encountered the wider world. The town had a church, which was the town's most substantial building and its most significant institution after the market. The church organised the year through its calendar, organised the week through Sunday observance, organised the day through the bells. The priest was one of the few literate people in the community and functioned as a point of connection to the wider world of the church hierarchy. The town had governance, a market tribunal that adjudicated commercial disputes, a series of local customs and rules that organised the use of common resources. This governance was not democratic in the modern sense, but it was not entirely arbitrary either. It was the accumulated negotiation of generations of people trying to live together in a small space with limited resources. The carpenter was part of all of this. He was a member of the craft guild, the organisation of carpenters and joiners that regulated the trade, maintained quality standards, protected the interests of its members against outside competition. He was a member of the church parish. He was a participant in the market economy. He was a neighbour, with all the obligations and relationships that entailed. His day was solitary in the workshop, but embedded in a community. The community's sounds were around him all day. Its gossip reached him through his wife's market trips. Its needs were what created his commissions. And at night the community was also sleeping. The blacksmith in his house, the baker in his, the alewife, the merchant who had stopped overnight, the priest in the rectory adjacent to the church, all of them in the same night, in the same dark, under the same sky. The town is sleeping, as you are sleeping, or becoming so, in the quiet that is a sleeping town's quiet. Good night. The loft. Let us spend a little time in the loft where the carpenter slept, because the physical space of sleep is worth attending to. The loft was reached by a wooden ladder, a simple ladder of 2 uprights with rungs pegged between them. The opening in the floor of the loft was a hatch, not a door. You climbed through it from below. The hatch might have a cover that could be dropped to reduce the cold air rising from below, or it might simply be an open hole in the floor. The loft was low. In most medieval houses, the loft ceiling was the underside of the roof, which sloped. At the ridge of the roof, the height was greatest, perhaps 5 feet, perhaps less. At the sides, where the roof came down to the walls, the height was much less, and you could not stand upright there. This meant that moving in the loft was done crouching or crawling, or by knowing exactly which paths allowed you to move at the heights available. The inhabitants of the loft knew its geometry by long familiarity, exactly where you could stand without hitting your head on a rafter, exactly where the floor was solid and where it was a gap. The mattresses were laid where they fit with access to the hatch, so that getting up in the night was possible without stepping on the children. The children's mattresses were against the far wall, under the lower part of the roof. The parents' mattress was nearer to the hatch. In the loft on an autumn night, the temperature was cooler than the main room below, which was still warmed by the banked fire. The cold of the outside air came through the thatch above. Thatch was not a perfect insulator, and the loft was cool in the way that a room without a direct heat source is cool when the outside air is autumn cool. The blanket was important. A heavy wool blanket laden over the sleeper trapped the body's warmth and made the loft comfortable enough despite the ambient cool. The wool held heat effectively even when the wool itself was cold at first. Once your body had warmed the air trapped in the wool's fibres, the blanket was its own small warm world. He lay under the blanket. The thatch above was a few feet away, closer than a modern ceiling right there, the underside of the roof visible. The sounds of the night came through the thatch. Wind, if there was wind. Rain, if there was rain. A specific sound, the multiple soft impacts of drops on the straw, a consistent sound that was in its own way very restful. Tonight there was neither wind nor rain. The night was still. The sounds from below, the small sounds of the banked fire settling, occasionally a pop from the wood, otherwise quiet, the sounds of the children breathing nearby, and outside the town quiet. The carpenter lay in the dark of the loft, and the warmth of the blanket accumulated around him, and the day's work settled into the body's memory, and sleep came, as it comes now, in whatever your loft is, in whatever your version of the heavy blanket is, in the dark, in the quiet, sleep, good night. The specific smell of the workshop. The workshop smelled of wood. Not one kind of wood, but the accumulated smell of all the kinds of wood that had been worked there over the years. The sharp, almost spicy smell of freshly cut oak. The sweeter smell of ash. The resinous smell of pine when any pine was worked. The fine dust of all of them mixed together and settled into the walls and the floor. Underneath the wood smell was the smell of iron. The tools lightly oiled to prevent rust, giving off the slightly metallic smell of iron and oil. This smell was subtle but present, detectable at the edge of the wood smell, and underneath that, the smell of the floor, packed earth and old shavings and years of use. The floor of a working workshop accumulates its own particular smell over time, not unpleasant but specific, the smell of a place where physical work has happened for a long time. This smell was the smell of work to him. When he entered the workshop in the morning, the smell was one of the ways he knew he was there. It was part of the texture of the workday. The smell of the workshop was as specific and as unremarkable as the smell of the house or the smell of the town's particular air. When he left the workshop at the end of the day, the smell went with him slightly, in his clothes, in his hair. His wife could tell from his smell that he had been working in the oak today rather than the ash. These smells were information. In a world without written records for most people, sensory information was more prominent than it is for us. The nose and the eyes and the hands registered the world more directly, more immediately, with less mediation from devices and systems that process the world on our behalf. The smell of the workshop, the smell of the morning fire, the smell of the pottage cooking, the smell of rain coming. These smells were the texture of the day, as the smell of your room is the texture of your night. Whatever specific smell surrounds you, familiar, unremarkable, simply there, your environment, your night, breathe it in and sleep. Good night. The water that was fetched. We have mentioned the fetching of water several times, but let us stay with it for one more moment, because the fetching of water was so central to medieval daily life that it deserves the time. Every drop of water used at the carpenter's household today was fetched by someone. The first fetch of the morning, before the household was fully awake. Perhaps his wife, or the older child, carrying the wooden bucket to the nearest water source and back. This fetch provided the day's first water, for the morning fire, for the morning meal, for the washing of faces, for the baby. Then, perhaps a second fetch later in the morning, when the first supply had been used. Cooking required water, washing required water, the animals in the yard required water, then possibly a third depending on the day's activities and the workshop's needs. Each fetch was a round trip of perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 15, depending on the distance to the source and the weight of the full bucket on the return. 3 fetches in a day might represent 40 minutes of water carrying, added to all the other demands on the household's time. The water source itself varied. A well in the yard or nearby was the ideal, clean water, conveniently located, available at any hour. A public conduit or a shared well in the street was less convenient but still adequate. A stream or river at some distance was the least convenient, and its water was less likely to be clean. The quality of the water was a genuine concern. Water from a contaminated source could carry illness. The connection between contaminated water and specific diseases was not understood. The germ theory of disease was centuries away, but the observation that water from some sources was associated with illness was widely understood, and people generally preferred cleaner sources when they were available. Boiling water before drinking it was not a universal practice, though cooking water was boiled in the course of cooking. The common alternatives to plain water, ale, cider, wine where it was available, were safer to drink precisely because fermentation reduced microbial contamination. All of this water management, the fetching, the storage, the careful use, the preference for safer sources, was daily thought and daily labour. The bucket at the end of the day held some water still. Tomorrow it would need to be fetched again, as tomorrow always brings the same necessities. But tomorrow is not tonight. Tonight the bucket is there, and the household is in its sleeping spaces, and the water waited patiently for tomorrow's use, as all things wait, in the quiet, in the dark. Good night. What filled the hours before technology? Let us take stock of what filled the hours of the medieval day in the absence of modern technology. Not the work hours which we have described, but all the other hours. Before the internet there was conversation, direct conversation face to face with whoever was present. The evening conversation by the fire covered the same range of topics that people cover now. What happened today? What people you know are doing? What is worrying you? What is pleasing you? Stories from the past, speculation about the future. The difference was that you were talking to people you knew well in real time, with no way to communicate with anyone beyond walking distance, without physically going to them. This enforced locality of conversation meant that the same small circle of people were in each other's company very consistently. The carpenter knew his wife's opinions on most subjects because they had discussed most subjects over many evenings. The familiarity was complete in a way that the greater mobility of modern life often prevents. Before television and cinema there were stories, told, not watched. The storyteller was not a professional in most cases. Storytelling was a general social skill, the ability to hold an audience with a narrative, to pace the telling, to give the right details and leave out the wrong ones. Good storytellers were appreciated and sought after. The story was how historical knowledge, moral instruction, entertainment and community identity were transmitted. The stories told in medieval households were not all literary. Many were personal. The story of what happened at the market today, the story of the neighbour's dispute with the miller, the story of something that had happened years ago and was worth telling again. These personal stories were the small literature of daily life. Before recorded music, there was made music. People sang. Not always well, not always for an audience, but singing was a normal human activity in a way that it is less so now. Work songs, hymns, ballads, simple melodies passed from generation to generation. The carpenter might not sing particularly well, but he knew the songs that everyone knew, and they came out when there was reason for them. At harvest, at feasts, at church, occasionally at the evening fire. Before books in every house, there were those who read aloud to those who did not. In a household where one person could read, perhaps a merchant's household where the merchant had some literacy, reading aloud to the family was a form of entertainment and education. The Bible, lives of the saints, romances and histories if they were available. Before organised entertainment of any kind in the evening, there were games, dice games, board games with simple equipment, a board scratched in wood or chalked on stone, pieces of carved wood or smooth pebbles, children's games that required no equipment at all, running and catching, games with rhymes and rules. These things filled the hours, not as efficiently as modern technology fills ours. There were certainly slow evenings, evenings when the fire burned and there was nothing particular to do, and the time passed without any particular activity to anchor it. These slow evenings were not considered problems to be solved. They were simply evenings. The mind wandered. The hands worked their simple tasks. The fire burned. Time passed, and then sleep came, as it comes now, in the slow evening of this night, wherever the mind has been wandering, whatever the hands have been doing. Sleep comes. Good night. The bread again. The bread deserves one more mention, because bread in the Stevel world was such a central thing, central to diet, central to the economy, central to the symbolism of daily life, that no account of the medieval day is complete without it. The bread that the carpenter ate today was dense and dark, not the airy white bread of modern bakeries, probably rye bread, or a mixture of rye and a lesser proportion of wheat, because wheat was the better grain, but rye was more reliably productive in many northern European conditions, and a modest household might use wheat sparingly, reserving it for special occasions or using it only as a supplement. The rye bread was heavy. A slice of it had substance. It filled the hand, it filled the belly. Eaten with the morning pottage or dipped in the midday broth, or eaten plain with the scraping of whatever fat was available, the bread was the foundation of every meal. The baker's skill was in the management of the sourdough culture, the living colony of wild yeasts and bacteria that leaven the bread and give it its flavour. The sourdough was fed daily, a portion taken for baking and the rest replenished with fresh flour and water, the culture maintained alive, across years and decades. The flavour of a household's bread was specific to that household's sourdough culture, which had developed its particular character over years of management. A neighbour's bread tasted slightly different because their sourdough was different. The small local ecology of yeast and bacteria produced distinctive flavours that were completely natural and completely unpredictable from a scientific standpoint, simply the accumulated result of this culture in this kitchen with this flour and this water. This is one of the things that modern food production has lost, the extreme local specificity of food flavours that were shaped by the specific conditions of their production. Not worse necessarily. Modern bread has its own qualities, but different. The bread today was the bread it was because of the sourdough that had been in this household for years, perhaps inherited from a parent's household, fed daily with the same flour from the same local mill, given the same water from the same local well. Specific, local, the product of accumulated time, as you are the product of accumulated time, as this night is the product of the day that accumulated before it, and the sleep is here, accumulated, ready. The bread is eaten, the day is done, the night is here. Sleep, good night. the body at night. The medieval body at night was doing what the human body does at night, which is what it has always done, which is what it is doing now. The muscles were releasing the tension they had held all day. The spine, having been vertical for most of the day's working hours, was now horizontal, the discs between the vertebrae rehydrating slightly in the absence of the day's compressive load. The hands, which had gripped tools all day, were relaxed and open. The heart was slowing its pace from the working rate to the resting rate. The breathing was slower and deeper than during the day's exertion. The body temperature was at its natural low for this part of the day, slightly cooler than during activity. The brain was doing its night work, consolidating the day's experiences into longer-term memory, clearing metabolic waste products that accumulated during waking activity, running the processes of repair and maintenance that required the relative quiet of sleep. None of this required the carpenter's conscious participation. The body knew how to do it, and did it, as it did it every night, as bodies have done it every night since human bodies existed. The night's work of the body is one of the oldest and most reliable things there is. It requires only the opportunity, the dark, the quiet, the horizontal position, the absence of urgent demands. The medieval carpenter gave his body these things. You give yours these things, and the body does what it knows how to do, which is sleep, which is repair, which is prepare for tomorrow. And tomorrow will be the same day in its structure. The fire, the water, the work, the tools, the meals, the evening, the sleep. As every day was the same day in its structure for 3,000 years of medieval life. The structure holds, the body does its work, and the night passes. Good night, the last sounds of the day before sleep, the last sounds. The fire below settling into its banked state. A soft sound, a sigh of settling ash. Perhaps a small pop as the wood completed some final adjustment in the heat. Then quiet. The fire was not loud. The banked fire was not silent either. It was simply there, doing its slow work of holding the heat through the night, its sounds the sounds of something alive at a low level. Outside, the town was mostly quiet at this hour. A dog somewhere, a brief bark and then nothing. The sound of the wind in the thatch, a specific sound different from wind in other materials. A low, hushing rustle. The movement of the straw in the wind, not alarming but present. The children in their corner of the loft were breathing. The regular deep breathing of children who fall asleep completely and sleep completely. The breathing that has a specific quality. The slowness of it. The evenness. The unmistakable sound of someone who is genuinely and entirely asleep. And outside, after the wind paused, the silence. The medieval silence that was a genuine silence, without the underlying hum of machinery and electronics that modern silence contains. The absence of the sound of cars in the distance, the absence of the sound of refrigerators and heating systems, the absence of the faint electronic buzz of devices, the genuine silence of a world without machines, into which the small sounds of the natural world fell very clearly. The distant river, if there was a river, the sound of an owl somewhere, the sound of the weather, whatever the weather was doing, and then nothing, the silence, which is as available to you now as it was to the carpenter in his loft, the background sounds of your own place, not the medieval silence, but your silence, your specific quiet, the quiet of where you are, which is enough, which is exactly the quiet that sleep requires. Not more, exactly this. Your quiet, your dark, your night. Sleep now. good night. The day without technology considered. We have spent this night in a day without modern technology, without clocks or phones or electric light or running water or power tools or refrigeration or motor vehicles or any of the countless things that organize and accelerate and smooth modern daily life. What the medieval carpenter had in place of these things, he had time, not in the sense of more hours. The hours in a day were the same then as now, but the time moved differently, organized by the work rather than by the clock, filled with the specific textures of specific tasks rather than the abstracted minutes and hours of monitored time. The time was experienced more directly. He had knowledge, not more knowledge in total than a modern person has access to. A modern person has access to more information than any medieval person could have imagined. But his knowledge was more immediate, more embodied, more directly connected to the specific materials and conditions of his daily life. His knowledge was in his hands and his eyes and his accumulated observation of the world immediately around him. He had presence, again, not more presence than we can achieve, but presence that was required by the conditions of his life. You had to be present to use the tools. You had to be present to navigate the town without assistance. You had to be present to read the weather. The world demanded his attention, and he gave it, not as a discipline, but as a necessity. And he had the night, the full, dark, quiet night, without screens, without notifications, without the ambient light that keeps modern people's nights from being truly dark. The night that was simply night, and in it simply sleep, which is what we have been heading toward all along, through the fire and the water and the tools and the joints and the bells and the meals and the children and the candle and the loft, always toward this, the sleep, which is here, now, as it was for him, the same sleep, the same dark, the same rest, the same body's need, met in the same way. Good night. One more pass through the day. Let us go through the day one more time, very slowly, just the sensory moments, the way they felt from the inside. The cold of the ladder rungs under the feet in the early morning, the rough wood of the rungs familiar in the dark, the descent to the main room automatic. The smell of the fire being revived, the first thin smoke from the new fuel catching, the shift in the air as the fire began to draw through the chimney hole, the warmth that followed, the weight of the water bucket on the walk to the well, empty, light, swinging freely, full, heavy, pulling the arm and the shoulder, the weight distributed, between the hand and the body's counterbalancing, the cold of the water on the face in the morning wash, the specific cold of aqueduct water or well water or stream water, depending on the source, cold and clean, the face waking under it, the heat of the pottage in the bowl, the steam rising, the density of the porridge as the spoon moved through it, the wood of the workshop floor under the feet as he entered. Not cold. The earth floor insulated itself, but not warm either. The specific feel of wood shavings underfoot, the soft, slightly slippery surface of accumulated shavings, the weight of the plane in the hand, just right, familiar and balanced, the wood of the handle worn smooth by years of gripping, fitting the hand as only a long-used tool fits. The resistance of the oak under the blade, firm, requiring effort, the grain sometimes cooperating and sometimes pushing back, the sound of the shaving coming off, a hiss, a curl of wood unfurling and falling, the light on the wood's surface as the first board was lifted to check, the south light coming through the window opening at an angle, revealing the texture of the surface, the slight ridges where the blade had tracked, the places where more work was needed. The specific sound of the chisel entering the wood for the mortise, a clean, deep sound as the mallet drove the chisel in, the wood compressing before the blade, the cut opening. The bell for terce, heard through the workshop walls, a clear, single note, resonant, carrying through the still autumn morning air. The bell was the town's voice, and its voice was this: the warmth of the midday fire as he came in for the meal. The fire that had been going since early morning was at its working height, the heat substantial, the main room warm in a way that the workshop never quite was, the density of the bread at midday, pulling a piece from the round loaf, the crust firm and slightly resistant, the crumb dense and moist, the flavour of the rye, sourdough, slightly sour, slightly nutty, filling. The quiet of the midday rest, the body horizontal after the morning's vertical effort, the specific relief of lying down when you have been standing and working, the release of the muscles that had been in use, the breathing slowing, the afternoon light which was different from the morning light, lower now coming from the southwest, the shadows falling the other way, the workshop lit differently than it was in the morning, the satisfaction of the fitted joint, the tenon entering the mortise cleanly, the shoulders seated firmly, the joint tight and square, running a finger along the joint's line, feeling that it was flush. Good. The bell for vespers, heard in the late afternoon, the end of the working day declared, the tools set aside, the workshop quiet, the evening fire built up for the meal, the different smell of a well-burning fire compared to the morning's struggling one, fuller, more aromatic, the wood dry and burning cleanly. The evening meal, the family around the table, the bowls filled, the bread broken, the conversation of the day's small events, the warmth of the room, the light of the fire and the candle, the tallow candle's light on the faces around the table, warm, moving slightly, the shadows responsive to the small movements of air in the room, the warmth of the banked fire diminishing slowly as the evening progressed, the room cooling slightly toward the end of the evening, the climb of the ladder to the loft, the familiar rungs, the familiar hatch, the low ceiling above, the mattress, the specific feel of straw beneath the linen covering, the surface giving slightly, not the softness of a modern mattress, but adequate, the body accepting it as it always had, the blanket, the weight of it settling over the body, the wool's specific texture, the warmth accumulating, the dark above, the underside of the thatch, close, familiar, the specific dark of this particular loft, and then the sounds receding, the fire below, the children breathing, the town quiet, and sleep. This is the day. This is the sensory texture of the day without modern technology in the Middle Ages, not dramatic, not particularly eventful, simply a day of work and food and the company of the people nearby, as days have always been, in their basic structure, as your day was today, and now your night is here, and all the sensory moments of your day are settling into the past where they belong, and the mattress is under you, and the blanket or the duvet or whatever your cover is over you, and the dark is here, and the sounds of your place are around you, and sleep right here, now. Good night. The moment before sleep. The moment before sleep is always the same for the medieval carpenter in his loft, for the Egyptian farmer on his reed mat, for the sailor on the ship in the trade winds, for the scholar in the scriptorium, for the desert caravan traveller under the stars, for all the people in all the stories in this series. The moment before sleep is the moment when the day finally lets go. Not because you decided it, not because you accomplished a specific thing, simply because the night has done its work and the body has done its work, and there is nothing more required of waking consciousness right now, and the sleep comes. The medieval carpenter did not decide to fall asleep. The sleep arrived, as it always arrived, and his awareness receded into it without drama, as your awareness is receding now, or beginning to, or moving toward that. The day has done what days do. The night is doing what nights do. The body is doing what bodies do. And sleep is here, the moment before it. This one, and then the sleep, and then the morning eventually. But the morning is far away. Now is this, only this. Good night, the night that holds all of them. All the medieval carpenters who ever lay down in their lofts at the end of a working day, all the nights they had, all the fires they banked and the ladders they climbed and the blankets they pulled over themselves, all the dark lofts with the thatch above and the children breathing in the corner, all the quiet towns, all those nights extending back through the centuries, hundreds of years of medieval craftspeople ending their days this way, and now you, ending your day, in your version of the loft, in your version of the dark, with your version of the quiet, the long line of night stretching back, the same need, the same rest, the same sleep. You are part of the long history of people lying down at the end of the day, the carpenters and the farmers and the scholars and the sailors and the merchants and all the others, all of them having their night, all of them in the dark, all of them in the quiet, all of them in the sleep that came when it came, and you, here, now, in the same night, not their night, your night, but the same kind of night, and the same kind of sleep, available, real. Here, take it. The night holds all of them, and the night holds you. Good night. The thatch above. The thatch above the carpenter's sleeping loft was a specific material with specific qualities. Thatch was made from bundles of straw, wheat straw, rye straw, or reed, depending on what was locally available, tied into bundles and laid in overlapping courses from the eave upward, like the scales of a fish, each course covering the tops of the course below it. The thickness of a well-laid thatch roof was considerable, a foot or more of packed straw, and this thickness was what gave it its excellent insulating qualities. A well-maintained thatch roof was weather-tight. The rain ran off the sloped surface, carried down the slope by the thatching material, the overlapping courses preventing water from penetrating the layers. Only where the thatch was thin or damaged, at the ridge, at the edges, where animals had disturbed it, was there risk of leakage. The underside of the thatch, visible from the loft, was dark from years of absorbed smoke from the fires below. Smoke from an open hearth in a house without a proper chimney filled the upper part of the room and percolated through the thatch, where it escaped slowly. The thatch absorbed the smoke and was blackened by it over years. This blackening actually helped preserve the thatch. The tar compounds in the smoke were somewhat protective against the insects and fungi that degraded the straw. The specific smell of an old thatch ceiling was the smell of old straw and old smoke combined. An earthy, slightly sweet, slightly acrid smell that was the smell of the roof that had been above many years of many lives. From his mattress in the loft, the carpenter could see the underside of this roof if he chose to look up, the darkness of the blackened straw, the shadows of the rafters above, the small movements if the wind was blowing, the year thatch settling and shifting in the gusts, the sound of it. And if it rained, the sound of rain on thatch was one of the more immediately present sounds available in the loft, a soft, consistent, enveloping sound, the rain falling on the straw above and the sound of it coming through clearly, not the sharp percussion of rain on tile or metal, but a muffled, softer sound like 1,000 small whispers. Tonight there was no rain. The thatch above was still. The night outside was still. The loft was dark and quiet, and the carpenter was asleep, and the thatch was simply the thatch, doing its patient, insulating, weathering work above the sleeping household, as your ceiling does its patient work above you, holding the night at the right distance, creating the enclosed space in which the body can rest, the ceiling above you, whatever it is, simply there, above you, while you sleep. Good night. The morning that follows this night, the morning that follows this night will come, not immediately. The night has its full course to run, and the night is doing that now, the hours passing at their own pace. But the morning will come, and when it comes for the medieval carpenter, it will be the same morning it always was. The light through the thatch, the cold, the descent of the ladder, the fire to be revived. The same tools will be in the workshop. The chest commission will be in the state it was when he left it. The morning water will need to be fetched, and all of this will be fine. It will be manageable. It will be the ordinary morning, requiring no extraordinary effort, simply the continued application of the same knowledge and the same hands to the same work. The day will manage itself, as days do when you know what needs doing and have the tools and the knowledge to do it. And the night between now and that morning is for rest, not for preparing for the morning, not for reviewing the day that has passed, simply for rest, the rest that makes the morning possible. The rest that you are in right now, or are entering, or are moving toward. The rest that is not dramatic and does not require anything, simply the body lying down in the dark, simply the breath slowing, simply the sleep coming as it comes, as it has come to the medieval carpenter in his loft every night for decades, as it comes to you, now, in the dark, in the quiet, after the day, before the morning. Good night. The fire is banked, the ladder is climbed, the loft is reached, the blanket is pulled close, the thatch is above, the children are breathing, the town is quiet, the night is here, the day was ordinary and sufficient, the tools are set aside, the work waits for tomorrow, the sleep is here, this breath and this one and this one, the dark receiving you, the quiet holding you, the night doing its patient work, as it has always done, as it always will. Sleep now. Good night.